I can guarantee you every one of those boys, they just want to go home.
Alan Barnes was 17. He wasn't a hardened street kid, and he wasn't a troublemaker. He was just a quiet, gentle guy living in the northern suburbs, unemployed at the time. Maybe a little aimless, but known for being soft-spoken and trusting. Perhaps too trusting. On June 18th, 1979, Alan left a friend's house in the suburbs and did what thousands of teenagers did every day in the 70s. He stuck out his thumb. Hitchhiking wasn't seen as a death wish back then. It was just a way to get around. He made his way to Grand Junction Road, a busy arterial strip where cars rushed back and forth between the industrial north and the city. He stood by the roadside, expecting a ride home. Instead, he stepped off the face of the earth. For a long time, it seemed there were no witnesses, but a fragmented memory would eventually surface, offering a glimpse of Alan's final mistake. A witness reported seeing a young man matching Alan's description being picked up by a white HQ Holden sedan. The detail that makes the blood run cold isn't the car itself. It was a common sight on Australian roads. But who was inside? The car wasn't driven by a lone predator. It was carrying 3 or 4 men. Alan didn't get into a car with a stranger. He got into a car with a group. This suggests he was either overpowered instantly, or more likely, he was lured by a false sense of safety, believing a car full of men was less dangerous than a lone wolf. They likely looked like mates on a night out. They likely looked like help. 6 days later, the reality of what happened shattered the city's peace.
The body of Alan Barnes was discovered under a bridge near the South Para Reservoir at Williamstown on June the 24th, 1979.
This was no simple runaway case, and he hadn't died from exposure. He had been kept. The autopsy revealed a week of calculated cruelty.
A post-mortem showed he died from hemorrhaging and shock, caused by lacerations to the anus, allegedly by a bottle.
He had been intoxicated with alcohol and a sedative known as Noctec, restrained and abused for days before he was killed. The mixture of Noctec and alcohol created an almost lethal combination that would have made it impossible for Alan to fend off his attackers. But the horror didn't stop at the injuries. When Alan was found, he was fully clothed, and his garments were disturbingly clean given the muddy ravine where he lay. It appeared he had been washed and carefully redressed after death. This wasn't a frenzied dumping of a body. It was a ritual. At the time, the police couldn't see the full picture, blinded by the belief that serial predators were something that happened in movies or overseas. They treated Alan's death as a horrific, isolated tragedy. They saw a dead boy and a cold case. They didn't realise they were looking at the start of a pattern. They thought the danger had ended with Alan. They were wrong. Adelaide did not get years to return to its slumber. The horror struck again almost immediately. In late August 1979, just 2 months after Barnes was found, the silence broke again. Neil Muir was 25, though he looked much younger. On August 28th, he vanished from the city centre. There was no struggle, no scene. He simply ceased to exist. When his body was found the next day in the Port River, the police could no longer claim ignorance.
26-year-old Neil Muir, whose body was found in bags in the Port River, is a victim of a vicious gang.
The condition of the body escalated the horror. Neil hadn't just been killed. His body had been dismembered, cut up and placed into garbage bags. The head had been tied to the torso, with rope passing through the mouth and neck, and any identifying tattoos had been cut off. Toxicology reports revealed that once again, Noctec was found in the victim's system. This wasn't the work of a chaotic madman. This was the work of a group. After Muir, a terrifying pause settled over the city. It wasn't until 1981 that the nightmare returned. Peter Stogneff, only 14, disappeared in August 1981. Found nearly a year later, not in the hills, but in a remote farming property in Middle Beach to the north. His skeletal remains told the same story: abduction and disposal in remote, unforgiving terrain. But unlike the other two boys, Peter had been accidentally burnt by a farmer clearing the land. This made it impossible to do a toxicology report. However, the signs were still there: a dismembered skeleton cut into 3 pieces. The police began to realise they were chasing a ghost. Survivors started to trickle forward.
What were you saying to them? What did you do?
Oh, leave me alone, please leave me alone. Don't, all that. And someone else climbed in the bed. Ended up to be a bloke. And they said, there's nothing you can do about it.
What happened then?
Thought I was a dead man, to tell the truth. Lost about 3 hours of my whole life. I don't know what happened after that. I just passed out.
Terrified young men telling stories of being picked up by well-dressed men, taken to houses, drugged and assaulted. They spoke of a family of men, some who watched, some who acted. But these survivors were young, traumatized and often homeless. In the rigid culture of the 1980s police force, they weren't viewed as credible witnesses. They were dismissed, and because they were dismissed, the monsters remained free. By 1982, the innocence of the 70s was gone, replaced by the low hum of paranoia. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter. Hitchhiking, once a rite of passage, became a game of Russian roulette. The perpetrators were emboldened by the police's inability to catch them. Mark Langley was 18. He was seen as a good kid in the eyes of the public. On a mild February afternoon in 1982, he vanished. Unlike the earlier years, where a missing teen might be a write-off as a runaway for weeks, the alarm bells rang almost immediately. The police knew, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly, that the hunters were active again. Mark was found 8 days later in the Adelaide Hills. The forensics told a story of absolute control. The killers had held him, sedated him, and discarded him with a complete lack of remorse. Just as the other boys had done before him, Langley died of internal blood loss from rectal torture. Even more disturbingly, Langley had undergone surgery. Part of his bowels had been removed, professionally, before his death. Some people theorised that this might be because an item may have gotten stuck that could identify the perpetrators. But above all, it meant that they had medical knowledge. The investigation finally shifted gears. The term, the family, moved from a rumour to a working theory. Detectives began to realise they weren't chasing a lone wolf. They were chasing a secret society built on the suffering of boys. They suspected a complex ring of men protecting one another. But knowing the group existed wasn't the same as proving it. The police were drowning in information, but starved for evidence. They needed a mistake. June 1983. Richard Kelvin was 15. He was the son of a prominent Adelaide newsreader, a boy from a loving home with a bright future. His abduction wasn't just a crime, it was a statement. He was taken from a quiet, leafy street just meters from his house while running a simple errand. This time, the city didn't worry, it panicked. The media, which had reported on previous murders with a degree of detachment, was now personally invested. The face of the victim was on every television screen. Richard was held for 5 weeks. When his body was finally discovered in a remote airstrip in the Adelaide Hills in July, the grief of the city turned into a cold, hard rage.
The 15-year-old son of Channel 9 newsreader Rob Kelvin was abducted and held captive in a drugged state for 5 weeks before being murdered.
But Richard's tragic death provided the one thing that detectives had been missing: hard science. Because Richard had been held for so long, the transfer of trace evidence was undeniable. Pathologists found trace of a very specific, uncommon green carpet on Richard's clothing. Even more damning, they found animal hairs. Specifically, the hairs of a wire-hair terrier. The investigation led them to a name that would become synonymous with the evil in South Australia: Bevan Spencer von Einem. Von Einem was an enigma. To his neighbours, he was a doughy, soft-spoken accountant who lived with his mother. Physically, he was unthreatening, almost pathetic. with a high-pitched voice and a physique that earned him the nickname the Frog. He was arrogant and frequently threatened the police with lawsuits for harassment, fully believing his knowledge of the law would shield him. When police raided his home in November 1983, the science closed the trap. The green carpet in his mother's house was a match. The wire-haired terrier in his yard was a match. Von Einem was not a lone wolf. He was a Pied Piper. Police discovered that he had spent years cultivating a court of followers. He surrounded himself with vulnerable young men, drifters, runaways, and the intellectually disabled, whom he manipulated with a mix of fatherly advice, cash, and prescription drugs. He didn't just hunt, he recruited. Inside his home, investigators found a laboratory of obsession. There were coils of rope, caches of prescription sedatives, and sophisticated surveillance equipment. But perhaps the most disturbing was his library. Von Einem possessed an extensive collection of medical and anatomical textbooks. He wasn't just a pervert. He was a student of the human body, obsessed with the mechanics of pain and control. This was a man who didn't just kill on impulse. He studied, he prepared, and he practiced. As the reality of Richard Kelvin's murder settled over Adelaide, a different kind of horror began to emerge. It didn't come from a crime scene, but the interrogation rooms. The survivors began to speak. These were the boys who had escaped, the ones who walked into the trap and managed to walk out. For years, their stories had been dismissed as fabrications of troubled youth or drug-induced hallucinations. But now, with 5 bodies in the morgue, the detectives finally leaned in to listen.
That was the sort of evidence that made our suspicions and theories fit. And I would say every weekend, someone would have been picked up.
Their testimonies were harrowing, and they began to corroborate the fragmented witness reports from years earlier. The boys spoke of a white HQ Holden, a vehicle that prowled the streets like a hearse in waiting. They confirmed what the silence of the crime scenes had only hinted at. The abduction wasn't always a violent snatch. It was often seduction. Von Einem and his associates didn't always drag boys in the cars. They offered them lifts, they offered them work, they offered them money. They preyed on the financial desperation of street kids, using a friendly face to lure them into a nightmare. Once inside the car, the doors would lock and the facade would drop. The boys described being wedged between men in the back seat, realizing too late that the friendly lift was actually a mobile prison. Once taken to the houses, the boys described a theatre of cruelty. They spoke of waking up in strange rooms, paralyzed by sedatives, surrounded not by a single monster, but by a group. They described men who hurt them, men who drove them, and men who simply stood in the corner, watching with a terrifying passivity. But the tragedy of these testimonies was their fragility. Trauma had fractured the boys' memories. Timelines were blurred, faces were merged. In the eyes of the law, this inconsistency was a weakness. Defense lawyers would later tear these stories apart, using the boys' own trauma to paint them as unreliable. But to the detectives working the case, the consistency of the details, the specific car, the sedatives, the rituals, this was the proof they needed. They realised they weren't hunting a phantom, they were hunting a syndicate.
It's one of South Australia's longest-running murder cases. For years there have been rumours that a gang was involved, a well-organised ring of homosexuals known as the Family. A group of respected professional men, killers who are still free. Many of them prominent, even eminent Adelaide citizens.
The death of Richard Kelvin was a tipping point. It forced a reckoning that the state of South Australia could no longer avoid. The murder of a boy from a good family shattered the illusion that safety was a matter of social standing. Public pressure became a physical weight. The media, smelling blood and scandal, camped out on the steps of police headquarters. They demanded answers. They demanded arrests. The machinery of justice, so slow and rusted for the previous victims, suddenly roaring to life. Resources were poured into the investigation on an unprecedented scale. The welfare systems, which had allowed boys like Alan Barnes and Neil Muir to drift into the abyss unnoticed, faced brutal scrutiny. Yet despite the sudden influx of manpower and the fury of the public, justice remained agonizingly out of reach. The police knew who they were looking for. Names were circulating in the task force rooms, but they were hampered by the limitations of the era. Forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA profiling was a futuristic dream, and the clock was ticking. As the task force analysed the files of the 5 known victims, a chilling structure began to reveal itself. It was an ecosystem of abuse, held together by a terrifyingly specific chemical and medical signature. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of mandrax in the victims' systems. This was the first smoking gun. Mandrax wasn't a street drug you could buy in the corner in the northern suburbs. It was strictly controlled prescription sedative. The levels found in the boys were staggering, enough to keep them in a permanent twilight state for days or even weeks. They were kept on the very edge of consciousness, pliant and helpless, requiring careful medical management to ensure they didn't overdose and die before the killers were finished with them. But the horror went deeper than the drugs. The autopsies, particularly that of Mark Langley and Richard Kelvin, suggested that one of the perpetrators possessed specific surgical knowledge. The injuries inflicted on Kelvin were precise. Pathologists found evidence of anal dilation that had been performed not with brute force, but with what appeared to be medical instruments. The abuse was clinical, controlled, and prolonged. Furthermore, the bodies had been treated with a strange, grotesque care after death. The killers had washed the victims' bodies to remove forensic traces and then redressed them. In the case of Richard Kelvin, his clothes had been laundered and pressed before being put back on his corpse. In other instances, victims were found wearing items of clothing that didn't belong to them, suggesting the killers kept a communal pile of clothes for their victims. This wasn't just disposal, it was an act of macabre intimacy, suggesting a perpetrator who was comfortable handling dead bodies, perhaps a surgeon, a mortician, or a highly trained medic. Investigators began to map out the hierarchy of the family, realizing it mirrored a corporation more than a gang. They theorized the group met at the intersection of high society and the underground, specifically through Adelaide's beats, the gay and social circles, where class barriers dissolve in the dark. At the bottom were the recruiters and the workers. Men like von Einem acted as the interface between the street and the shadows. They took the physical risk, the abductions, the driving, the holding. Above them, investigators theorized a tier of elites. These were the facilitators. They supplied the mandrax, the surgical expertise, and potentially the secluded properties where the screams wouldn't be heard. Most disturbing of all was the theory of the audience. Survivor testimony hinted at men who were present during the torture but never raised a hand. They were there to watch. This led police to believe the group operated on a principle of mutually assured destruction. By forcing members to participate in different stages of the crime, one to drug, one to drive, one to watch, they ensured that no single person could go to the police without incriminating themselves. By the mid-1980s, the Adelaide police were staring at a map of horror that had been drawn over nearly a decade. The investigation had exposed a truth that was harder to swallow than the crimes themselves. A network of offenders had been operating with impunity, protected not by brilliance, but by the city's own refusal to see. The task force found themselves fighting a war against their own history. For years, information had died in the desk drawers, trapped in the silos of different station houses. There was no central brain to connect the dots. A reporter of an abduction in the northern suburbs wasn't compared to a body found in the south until it was too late. Worse still was the cultural blindness. The detectives were trying to convince a conservative establishment that respectable men with careers, suits, and standing were hunting children. It went against the grain of the Adelaide society. It was easy to question the credibility of a traumatized street kid than to investigate a pillar of the community. The killers had exploited this class bias, hiding behind their social status to remain invisible. The forensic pathologist worked in a time before the clarity of DNA. They couldn't give the detectives a name, but they gave them a method. The autopsies were a chorus of consistency, asphyxiation, prolonged restraint, and chemical signature of sedatives. The science proved that the victims hadn't just died, they had been owned before they were killed. The bodies dumped into a remote bushland spoke of a logistical operation, vehicles, transport, time, and privacy. It was a cold, hard confirmation of the family theory. Meanwhile, the city outside of the lab was boiling over. The media had turned the investigation into a daily spectacle. On one hand, the relentless headline forced the government to pour resources into the case, ending the era of neglect. On the other, the sensationalism created a fog of false leads and hysteria. The public perception shifted permanently. Adelaide realised these weren't isolated tragedies. They were witnessing a systematic failure to protect the vulnerable. When the cases finally reached the courts, the limitations of the law became painfully clear. The prosecution was trying to hold smoke. In 1984, Bevan Spencer von Einem was charged with the murder of Richard Kelvin. The trial was a sensation, a peek behind a curtain of depravity Adelaide had refused to believe existed. Von Einem was arrogant in the dock, often smirking, blowing kisses to the gallery, and behaving like a man who knew he was protected by something larger than himself. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but he never broke. He went to prison guarding the names of his accomplices like state secrets. He certainly had accomplices. In 1989, von Einem was charged with the murders of Barnes and Langley, relying heavily on a star witnesses known only as B. But the case never reached a jury. B, a man with an intellectual disability who claimed to have been present during the crimes, had his testimony dismantled in pre-trial hearings. The defense didn't just attack his memory, they attacked the police work. They successfully argued that B was highly suggestible, and that eager detectives had inadvertently fed him details during unrecorded interviews. The judge ruled the evidence legally unsafe, declaring the testimony had been so polluted by the investigation process that a fair trial was impossible. The charges were dropped. Convictions were secured for von Einem, but for the wider network, it was a stalemate. A single man went to prison, but the family, the shadowy collective of facilitators, the providers of the mandrax, the men who watched from the shadows, was never fully dismantled. The gavel came down, but it didn't echo with the finality the families deserved. It felt less like justice and more like a contaminated strategy designed to stop the rot from reaching the highest level of Adelaide society. As the years rolled on, the dust settled, but the scar remained. The Adelaide Family Murders left a legacy, unresolved questions that still haunt the state. The full roster of the network remains a mystery. The extent of the institutional complicity, just how much of the perpetrators were shielded by their social standing, remains a subject of dark debate. But most chilling of all, the spectre of von Einem began to stretch even further back in time. While in prison, von Einem allegedly bragged to cellmates about knowledge regarding the disappearance of the Beaumont children, Australia's most infamous cold case in 1966. While police could never substantiate the link, the very possibility that the family had roots stretching back decades before Alan Barnes suggests a generational evil that Adelaide has never fully purged. The story of the family murders is not just a story of 5 boys who died. It is a story of a city that failed them. It demonstrated how predators could exploit the cracks in welfare system, targeting boys who they believed wouldn't be missed. It showed how a family could be built on abuse, binding men together in a pact of mutually assured destruction. The investigation changed policing in South Australia forever. It forced a modernisation of forensics, a rethink of how survivor testimony is handled, and a shattering of the naive belief that evil doesn't wear a suit and tie. But for the family of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, Mark Langley, and Richard Kelvin, the family was not a case study. It was the thief that stole their sons. And while the files may be closed, the silence of the Adelaide Hills holds secrets that may never fully be told.